All the traditions are in agreement that we have three ranges on the spectrum of consciousness that are available to us. And that when we're fully charged, we are in our divine nature. In the first yuga of the cycle, all of us are in divine consciousness. That's what is called being an avatar. Nothing less than that. So understand that divine nature is a level of energy. Once we come into the cycle and we have a certain charge of energy, that's all we get. And that energy is going to go down. It doesn't go up, it goes down. And so in the second age, the silver age or Treta Yuga, we're in a semi-divine state, but we're already falling. And then by the time we get into the Dwapara Yuga, we have become humans, but a higher type of human. And then when we get into the end of Dwapara and the beginning of Kali Yuga, we are lower kinds of humans, but still human. And then as Kali Yuga ends, nearly everyone enters the demonic nature and loses the human qualities. And so because of that, it requires a very radical self-transformation to escape from the demonic state, which produces suffering, destruction, death, evil, all of that we are witnessing, and chaos on a physical as well as a social and political level. So the human is a hybrid. The ego partakes of subconsciously the demonic nature and superconsciously can touch into the divine nature. But as you fall more and more into the demonic state, the divine is inaccessible. And then one comes completely under the laws of karma, because there is no grace, no salvation, because the demonic nature has no love and is not able to receive love, divine love. And that cuts one off from being able to charge the battery. That's what has to happen. The battery is dead, literally, at the end of the Kali Yuga, and you've got to charge it. That's what we're here to do. That's what yoga is about. But to charge the battery, we have to connect to the source, and the demonic nature resists that connection because it's threatened by it. So the world is a war between gods and demons. And at the end of Kali Yuga, the demons have almost won. They don't even believe that there are any gods left who need to be defeated, because there aren't. But what there are former gods. There are those who remember somewhere deep down that you used to be in a higher state in another lifetime. You have that memory. And the more that you begin to meditate, the more the remembrance of that higher consciousness and the information it contains and the love and the light and the beauty begins to dawn again from within. And as it does, one is able to then make a connection to the source of the power that made you divine in the first place. It's not enough to remember being once divine. You have to connect with the power again to re-divinize your consciousness. This is not about nostalgia or trying to have a past life experience. No, this is about becoming now again a divine being. But a demon cannot even entertain that thought for very long. And so we are reaching a point now at the end of Kali Yuga where everything is totally polarized. As below, so above, right? In the same way that humanity has now been split between the vaxxed and the unvaxxed, we are now split between those who are in the divine nature and those who are in the demonic. There are no more hybrids. There's no more neutrality. Okay, I'll listen to the angel, I'll listen to the devil, I'll make my decision. It won't work. The devil's got you. The moment you give up your divine nature, you're in the grip of the demonic force. So unless there's a total surrender and a total yearning for transcending the demonized human nature, with whatever margin of health, of sanity, of power, willpower one has left, one has to use it. So right now, everyone is torn between gnosis and psychosis. There isn't even neurosis anymore to kind of have as a middle ground. It's a psychotic world now. That's the norm. And so you are going to be in a psychotic state if you are not in the state of total, liberated, blissful consciousness. It really is that extreme, a polarization that is now occurring on this plane. And so the line has been drawn, and you have to decide which side of the line you're on. You can't be on the fence. There is no fence. And if you try to be in the middle and say, I'll just muddle through my human existence and try to enjoy things as much as possible, you'll be grabbed by the demonic force. So there's an urgency of making the choice. On what side are you? Do you belong to God or do you belong to the devil? It really is that clear and complete a choice. You can't be halfway. You can't be partially pregnant. You can't be partially vaccinated. You can't be partially demonic and partially divine. It doesn't work. That's the decision that has to be made at the outset to begin the journey as a Sat Yogi. If there isn't total determination, I'm choosing God and the divine nature, you won't have the willpower and the grace to escape from your own dark side, from those maras that we talked about, that are already in your mind and they have usurped your mind and they're causing you to commit bad karma and to be stupid and confused and not in your right mind, literally. So you either have to totally get out and get out now without delay, or say, okay, I belong to the demons, and all that goes with that choice. So things are serious. Now Machik was faced with the same choice, and this was, back in 1100, and things were already bad enough that she had to make great efforts to defeat her own maras. And this woman was a child prodigy. She was extraordinarily intelligent, so intelligent that she was invited into the monasteries to memorize all the sacred texts, the Pragya Paramita, these huge sutras of thousands and thousands of lines. She memorized them better than any of the monks. And the head of the monastery would hold competitions, and all of these old monks would try to repeat it, and she would be able to do so much faster, so much better than they would. They'd make mistakes, she'd correct them. She was like a 5-year-old girl, and these guys could not keep up with her. So because of that, she was put in advanced training, okay? And in that advanced training, she had tutoring by some very powerful and advanced lamas. So she got a lot of help, but that help that came was the result of her own good karma to have that intelligence and have that ability to use it in service of spiritual development. And what happened was a relationship became developed between her and the Ishta Devi of Tibet, who is named Tara. Tara is the great goddess who is the protectress of Tibetan spirituality. And Tara took Machik under her wing. And she began to have visions of Tara, and then at one stage there was a total encounter. Tara actually appeared. At the ego level of these beings?
Yeah, or like what's motivating them?
Well,
it has to be at the ego level.
Yeah, at the ego level, of course, they're being motivated different. Money, power, control, all of the ego, ordinary greed type fantasies. And the elite that's in power now realizes the system is bankrupt, and the only way they can hold on is by killing off a lot of people and trying to then control what remains. So that's pretty ordinary, but it's all being done by a much higher power. They are instruments of a higher power, and the reason we reach this point and why people accept it. There was an interesting talk by this guy Malone, the guy who invented mRNA, right, talking about mass psychosis. Indeed, there is mass psychosis in the world. People are just committing suicide. It's a Kool-Aid cult, right, that the whole world has become. And so it could only have happened because people fell into too low a level of consciousness, and the human spirit became enslaved to the ego, and to fear and greed, and to the need for Big Brother to tell them what to do, and all of that. So we lost our sovereignty internally, and therefore we are no longer at the top of the food chain. We are no longer able to be stewards of the creation in the service of God, because our connection to God has been cut. Humans have been basically an atheistic species for the last 100 years or more. And so we have become totally narcissistic in our collective mindset. And that has resulted in a very savage kind of capitalism controlled by monopolistic forces that have no interest in the well-being of human beings, only in that power. But it had to happen in the same way that when a person becomes terminally ill, things start to happen in their body that will speed up the process of dying. so that there isn't a long drawn out torture. And then when the body, when the soul does leave the body, and right now the soul has left the human spirit, it's not here anymore. The humans are in a zombie state already. And so then you get, the worms start eating the body and the bacteria and all of that. These forces just represent the decomposition of the collective human body of our conscious being that has become terminally ill and in effect has already died. So those who still have that ability to return to God consciousness while in the body will bring that back in as most of the world is literally dying, but also they've already become zombies and are in a way soulless. If somebody wasn't soulless, they couldn't be doing what they are doing in the commission of mass murder like this. So this process is part of a death and rebirth cycle that the human spirit goes through each cycle of time. And it's a natural process: creation, fall, redemption. So you need to decide for yourself, am I part of the fall or part of the redemption? And as soon as you recognize that you are spirit, not body, and you turn to the source of your consciousness in the collective, in the cosmic consciousness and God consciousness, you will be raised. Your vibrational frequency will rise, and the rapture will literally happen. Your body is not going to go up in space, but your consciousness will expand into cosmic dimensions, and then you won't feel this as a destruction. You won't see any evil. You'll realize it's all part of the process. It has to happen that way, and that it's all a blessing. And you'll accept the perfection of it because your mind will already be in the timeless light, and you'll see the unfoldment of the next cycle already beginning. So it's not something that will have any disturbance for your consciousness, and you'll recognize its perfection and beauty. So that's the state you want to be in. So we continue our long rainy season retreat. I have found it necessary to be in at least semi-seclusion for a few days again because of needing to be clear on how much to say, especially because now we're speaking to a larger audience, and how to be of most help to those who are caught in the turmoil of the very rapidly accelerating situation of chaos in the world. And so tonight I would like to address those subjects because they are of urgent relevance to everyone. As we have seen with the rain, it comes in wave upon wave, and the waves of cataclysmic events are accelerating in their rhythm, their intensity, their global scope, and their violence. And we're still only at the beginning of this process. And because everything in the cosmos works on a fractal basis of self-similarity at all scales, we know that the same chaotic dynamics that are going on at the levels, let's say, of the international financial political system finds its equivalences and correspondences at each national level, at each level of social organization, corporate organization, family system organization, couples systems, and the individual psychological system. And what we are experiencing now in the world is the destruction of all of those systems. The chaotic coming apart and the loss of viability of every system. It's probably easiest to see it in the most complex systems like that of the US Empire, which we can see has at the very top splits and factions among the ruling elite, and then within each faction, whether it's the Pentagon or the CIA or the State Department or wherever we look, we see the same kinds of conflicting attitudes and a lack of a monolithic capacity even to carry out the plans that are intended by the exercise that is ongoing, because of the various different interest groups who are not in alignment with the consequences that are unfolding. And so we see it the same happening at every level, the same kind of an incoherence with the different forces and powers that are operating in every level. And this, of course, includes the system of Gaia herself, the geophysical system of intelligence, which is not, as the materialistic paradigm would say, made up of random events, but is very much correlated to and in sync with the unfolding chaos of all the complex systems in the world. And this extends even to the magnetosphere and to the relationship to the solar flares and to the asteroids that seem to be hurling at the Earth from outer space as well. So at every level we see these kinds of incoming forces of great magnitude and destructiveness that are threatening the coherence and the existence of our life form. So once we understand that we are dealing with a huge cosmic complex system that has now entered chaos, it is unraveling and imploding and simultaneously exploding in an accelerating panorama of disturbances from which the system cannot recover, has no longer any resilience or any reserve capacity to contain and to redirect those forces into some kind of a unified field of action. But we do see that we are in a phase that can be described perhaps best as the herding of the livestock to the slaughter. And In a way, it's a parallel to the famous ox herding pictures of the Zen tradition, where the Zen initiate has to catch the ox of consciousness and dominate it and ride it and then bring it back tame, and eventually it disappears and you have the circle and the empty space. But what happens to the ox? It's slaughtered and eaten, and in the same way, the human population is being led to a collective slaughtering, and it is happening slowly enough that most people can remain in denial of the trajectory of these events. And even though they cannot happen in the way that is ideally coordinated by those powers that are seeking a new order and to control that order, because while the general can give the orders to the troops to shoot, the troops may not follow those orders. So you have a chaotic indeterminacy that is also functioning at every level. And as we approach the moment when, no doubt through a tweet, people will receive the information, at least in the US, that the system is bankrupt, your dollars are worthless, sorry, and by the way, we're out of food, good luck. And very few people will know how to handle that situation. And that's when the chaos at an individual level and the anarchy that will ensue will have no force that can contain it. And so we see that we're heading into that moment that Yeats talked about in the Second Coming, when the center cannot hold and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dim tide is loosed, and this is already beginning, but only still at a relatively mild level of intensity that is being accelerated and jacked up notch by notch, day by day. And so as we see that, we also observe that if we are still ourselves in ego consciousness, that our own individual system also tends to go haywire and fall into dysregulation and be motivated by incoherent forces and tendencies that can create emotional volatility, meltdowns, and hysterical events, and inability to carry on a conversation because the energy gets too strong, and people lose it very easily if they are still in ego consciousness, still in that network of interdependencies that the ego is bound by and frustrated by, and its needs and demands and desires are not being met. And it always falls into a bewilderment of not understanding what is happening or why it is happening, because the ego cannot understand its own psyche. There's too much of its own forces that are subconscious, and it doesn't have access to the superconscious power of containment and understanding and higher development. So as we see the fall now become a straight drop into the lowest devolutionary level of human consciousness through this internal fragmentation and the fragmentation of the external world and the systems that the egos depended upon and took for granted that they would be able to spend their money, they have a job, they'll get their food at the grocery. All of these things that people took for granted are now falling away and leaving people in free fall and void, and without an understanding of how to find some kind of security in this very rapidly shifting, dancing landscape of a complex self-destruction of the systems of governance of our world and of our inner world. And thus it is imperative at this time to reach a higher level of consciousness than the ego. The ego will drown along with the other systems. It will not be able to endure, to survive, to deal with the shocks and the losses of loved ones and of substances and situations that became addictive and dependencies, and all of these situations of a lost security, a lost base at chakra 1 unravels all the developments of the ego at the higher levels and creates a regressive tendency to collapse back into dysfunctionality. And if we're not careful, we can all be prey to that kind of a force, since that is the vibrational frequency that is now hegemonically dispersing itself around the planet through the collective noosphere. And therefore, it is imperative to reach a level where we are immune from those forces and we are not producing those kinds of incoherent and conflicted forces within our own consciousness. Therefore, the only state that is adequate in order to be able to get through and navigate accurately this situation of continuing tribulations and destructive events is to be in that state that is referred to as the immovable, the changeless, the absolute consciousness that is who you are before you're ever born, after the body dies, beyond the world, and forever while the body and the mind function in the world remains the ground of your being. It is that changeless presence that we must now not simply contact, but realize as the true nature of yourself. Because if we are not in the changeless consciousness, then the changes that will happen to our consciousness will be those that lead to greater chaos. And therefore, in the changeless state, a higher order can be projected, can be created, can be connected with a node and a network of intelligences that can all depend upon beings who are in that immovable, changeless state to not have hysterical meltdowns or act erratically or in a way that is foolhardy and based on sentimentality and on a false understanding of the nature of what events we are passing through. That kind of a network of stability of those beings who are resonating in that immovable and inconceivable intelligence can disseminate that stabilizing vibrational frequency that others can attune to and then find some security and serenity and peace. So the ashram has to have and sustain such an environment of complete serenity and understanding and dispassion about all of the events that will seem like horrors to those who are sentimentally attached to the belief that the world is real. Only when we know that it's unreal, it's a dream, it's a passing phase of the end of a certain civilization that is exhausted and that needs to die and is dying quickly and mercifully, can we then be at that fulcrum that is the basis for the birth of the new that will replace that which is now dying, and be filled with the life energy and the power and the forces of light that will support the growth of a higher consciousness to bring about a new age, a new world, without any of the oppression or complexity or chaos of the world that is based on ego consciousness. But if we are not in that state and in that interconnected interbeingness and inner peace that can then be disseminated as a community that is in holy communion with that peace, can we sustain and be of service to beings wherever they are on the planet who can receive the transmissions that will be emanated by our energy field collectively. And so therefore, meditation is essential in this period. Silence and stillness, internally and externally. Not going out and protesting and fighting and becoming a target of violence and acting in ways that will end up being futile and vain. And it is this question of vain and vanity that is the virus that must be overcome. We must heal from the vanity of ego consciousness. That is the root cause of why all of our actions are now in vain and why the world is in the chaos that it is in. Because egos do not have real relationships with one another. They have projections based on their own desire to dominate and control whatever territories of real estate or of mental states that they wish to colonize. And this is the reason why we must emancipate ourselves from the colonial status that is the ego, that has colonized and usurped our consciousness and caused us to lead petty and meaningless lives that consist only of vain efforts to prove that we are not as lacking as we feel we are, because the ego lacks being and essence and truth and love and any capacity to sustain a coherent and beautiful world. So the ego consciousness and the vanity of the narcissistic complex that tends to take over our lives and reduce us to enslavement to the pleasure principle, in which we live for temporary sensory pleasures for the body that will result in always in a backlash of suffering and frustration and regression and the demise of our wholeness and of our sense of independence. That has to be let go. We must declare our independence from the ego mind if we are going to become independent of the events of chaos that are happening in the external world and be able to dream a new world into manifestation. And thus we have come forth with a declaration of independence from the ego that is an alternative approach for those who are stuck in situations of lockdown and chaos and external violence to realize there is something you can do, and it's very powerful, even though to the ego it will seem passive, but it is the raising of the vibrational frequency that can alone bring peace to the environment externally as well as internally. And when enough beings, a critical mass of beings, choose to raise their consciousness instead of raising hell, they will be able to bring about a new world. And we want to be leaders of that movement of creation from the source of love, from the source of intelligence, from the source of universal unity. And it's that unity consciousness alone that can bring harmony back to a world that is now raging in personal hell realms of terror and of megalomania. So this situation then can only be understood and can only be overcome by higher levels of consciousness, and really at this point only the highest level. And therefore it's important for each of us to determine for ourselves the highest priority that we can possibly give to the shift of our consciousness over anything that lower states of consciousness might impel us to do that would simply waste our energy, exhaust our resources, and create more karma, more backlash, more suffering, and more darkness in the world. So it is a very clear choice between the light and the dark, the transcendent or the incoherent mass of emotional outbursts that the ego is now prey to. And in the attainment of cohesive, silent presence, in which we can see things as they really are, understand what these events signify, and see the blessing hidden in the outer darkness, and be able to draw forth from these events what is the inherent goodness and the opportunity that the crisis offers us. We will be able to then serve the will of that supreme benevolent intelligence to bring about a better world dream from the nightmare that it has become. However, if we don't deliver ourselves, our own consciousness, from the jaws of these internal forces of corruption and chaos and self-defeat, we will not be able to help anyone else. Once you realize that the only force you can depend upon is that supreme consciousness, that nothing else is dependable, because it is all fictional and losing its value rapidly, whether it's money or social organizations that one depended on or other external forces, all of them are falling away, and the only power that we can depend on is the power of immovable presence that is divine and that is complete and whole, and therefore has no need. And because that consciousness is beyond the illusion of life and death, it can cope with whatever is to happen to the physical organism without fear and without loss of continuity of consciousness when the organism dies. Consciousness does not die. But if one is identified with the body and the ego, then one will go through a terrible, destructive process in the death throes of the organism and lose the coherence that one has worked so hard for, if one is a yogi, and one will not be able to then maintain that union with the light that can deliver us from the realm of chaos into the realm of celestial order, and to be part of the angelic forces that will bring to birth the next world or the eternal light beyond all worlds, whatever is our destination. It is at this moment that it is necessary to practice continually being in that state. If you don't practice it, and if you put it off and think, well, let me just enjoy a few more lower chakra jouissances, or be more concerned with the health of the body, or with the concern with external situations, or checking my bank account to see if I still have enough in there to feel secure, rather than depending on any of those things or taking them as priorities, it's important to practice the constant presence as the immovable awareness that transcends the ego persona. So we have said that the Supreme Being is the person, the Supreme Person, and there are persons and personal forces all the way down. But remember, there are two levels of the person. The persona is the mask, and the mask is a false self. You don't want to be identified with the false self, with the mask that is the ego consciousness. And the mask, the word persona, means through sound, sona, like sonar, we now have that word, sound. The voice that sounds through the mask, through the ego mask, is generally the voice of the ego consciousness. You don't want to listen to that voice in your mind. You don't want to listen to the thoughts of your ego mind, because they will deceive you. And likely they will attack you. And they will cause you to feel anguish and anxiety and guilt and shame and all kinds of negative emotions that will create more chaos and more paralysis. You want to be at the higher level of person, which in Greek is the prosopan, and that's not the voice of the ego mind, but that is the soul that can be perceived through the eyes. The eyes always are called the window of the soul. And when the soul is itself clear and transparent to the Holy Spirit, then that spirit becomes the person who is able to operate the organism and speak the words that come from that highest intelligence. But you don't want to find yourself speaking from lower states and creating more problems as a result of speech that's based on desire and fear rather than on truth and on love and on light. So this shift in the dynamics of our way of producing thoughts and of acting through the organism has to be complete, so that we don't oscillate between the higher consciousness and the lower. We don't want to create any more karma that will be the source of further suffering and the synchronistic appearance of events external to ourself that will produce suffering. But if you are internally in a state of chaos, you can bet that your world will also be filled with chaotic events and accidents and crashes and glitches and all of that, because the world is a reflection of our internal state of being. So we have more control over the world than we think, but we can't actualize it because we think from the wrong level. And only when we silence the level of the false self so that the real can be heard and can speak and can organize and can manifest, then we will create the conditions for the birth of a new world and the restoration of peace and harmony and joy on this planet. But otherwise, then the destiny will be much darker. This is the moment of truth. This is the moment when we have to prepare ourselves for what is coming. Because once it hits, if you have not prepared in advance, you won't suddenly be able to reach nirvikalpa samadhi and be unaffected by what's going on. You will be totally caught up in the chaos. And that preparedness requires tremendous self-discipline, of the real self disciplining the lower self into silence and stillness and receptivity to the intelligence that can bring about goodness in the world. We have been studying, we have been practicing, we have been learning about all of this, and now the events that will prove how much we have gained, how seriously we have taken our studies, how deeply we have gone into our own consciousness, is to be tested. This is the final exam. And the questions will get harder and harder that are posed to us by the events of the unfolding trajectory of our planetary history. And as we reach the omega point, the resistances from the lower levels of chaos and the externalized varieties of symptoms of that chaos that will come to us and may emerge in our bodily organisms as well, will have to be faced down with a tremendous power of peace, an invincible, victorious power of God consciousness that alone will be able to calm the tempest of emotions and of negative events that will seemingly appear and overtake our world. If we don't take this very seriously now and think we can depend on other people or other things to give us security and to get us through this, we're very much misunderstanding the nature of the tests that we face. We are designed to pass these tests. We are made in the image of the Supreme Being. We have access to that intelligence, that power, that love. But in order to have the current of energy flowing without intermittent blackouts, we have to be completely surrendered and dedicated and devoted and realized as to our true nature, or else we will shake. And the current of Shakti will be cut off, and fear will take its place, and all of the suppressed fantasies of the ego will fill the mind with paranoid ideation. To avoid that, we must now have freed ourselves from any egoic intrusions and purified the mind to become a holy temple, so that only God consciousness remains within the precincts of our being, not only individually, but universally. It is this that we are intended by God to attain and to pass on, to bring about a new world of peace. But to do it, we must be ready, and we must have eliminated all the internal fears and resistances that we will otherwise have to face in the middle of the critical moment, instead of having already prepared and attained mastery in advance. You don't want to be caught not having done your homework and not being ready for the examinations to come. You are all here because you were brought here in order to prepare. We are all here by grace, but now it is up to us to use that grace, to augment it through our practice, and to share it and disseminate it to all souls who want to receive help from the only source of help that is any longer available to us. May we all choose to be instruments and slaves of God, but freed from the ego enslavement that enables these organisms to function as godly instruments that will be protected by their employer. But if we are rogue elements wanting to act on our own as egos and think we can take care of ourselves, I don't need God's help, thank you very much, well, you might find out that's a mistaken assumption. So it is now the time when the understanding of non-duality is to be taken out of the box of theoretical belief systems and realized as the truth of our situation and our nature. Because only that realization of the non-dual unified field of consciousness and the intelligence of the Supreme Being and the union with that will be a sufficient means of overcoming the forces of darkness that must be filled with the light of God's presence through the instrumentation of beings of nobility and courage and who live in truth and in purity of being. May all of us choose to be such beacons of light in this time of darkness and not yield to any of the weaknesses that the ego mind might try to convince you that you have, because none of that is true. And we must realize that truth that is beyond words and beliefs and dogmas and theories, and be the living proof of the highest truth. Namaste. So, the floor is open. Speak loud.
This teaching really speaks to me. As you all know, I am new here, so a lot of these ideas and concepts are brand new to me, and while I feel them and know them on a soul level, like I know it's the truth, it's still, sometimes I can't fully grasp the wholeness of it. But where I'm struggling is, and I'm struggling right now,
You're not alone. Many are struggling.
Where I'm struggling is I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it physically. I'm feeling it not just from myself. I'm feeling it from like the collective we. I'm feeling the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts of so many people right now. And I'm feeling this sorrow and this crying out, this wailing. And I don't know how to contain that.
Well, maybe that's why you're here, to learn how to contain it in a larger level of consciousness than the one that you have recognized to be yourself. Because your real self is able to contain it, and not only contain it, but transform it. And that's what we are here to do. That's the work of those who serve God, to bring peace to those who are in agony and who are wailing. But it cannot come from political acts or acts of violence. It can only come from the peace of God that passeth the understanding of the ego, but that has the power to bring peace to all. And when that force becomes strong enough, when enough of us are vibrating with that love of God and sending that into the world, then the world will transform and it will become peaceful again.
So how will I truly know the right actions and the right words, even though I feel on a soul level that it's not about the words. And when my friends or people, or even like when people are coming to me or talking to me or asking me these big questions that I feel overwhelmed by, but I'm feeling it very deeply, how do I know what to...
When you have found God in your own heart, and you have reached that point where you are in resonance with God consciousness, your heart will be filled with peace, with joy, with coherence, with clarity, with confidence. You will know how to speak. It will be spontaneously done. There won't even be any ego thinking, what should I say, what should I do? No, everything will happen perfectly in accord with the will of God once you are aligned with that. So what you need to do now is not do anything but meditate and stay here long enough to get to that state and stabilize in it, and then you'll be able to help people wherever they might be who are connected with you and disseminate that energy to everyone. But if you're not in that state yet of stability, you will be contaminated by their anguish, and you won't be able to help them. You'll collapse into the same kind of incoherent terror and sadness, and that is not of any service to anyone. So you have to become safe first. Like they say in the airplane, you put the mask on yourself and then you help the child next to you, right? So you've got to have the oxygen of God's love and power, and then you can help others who are strangling because they don't have access to it. But if you are not safe and in God's arms, you're not going to help others to get there. Okay?
Thank you for another wake-up call. I was intrigued by your use of being God's slave. You mentioned that, and I think it's a very interesting concept or understanding that I'd like to hear a little more about. Please.
To be God's slave is the only real freedom. Because what that means is you are entirely at the call of, in the attendance to, and the service of God. You're no longer serving a separate ego. And the more that you do that, the more that you are in union with the one that you are serving, and the intelligence, the love, the power of that one then saturates your own consciousness. You become not different from that source of your being, and it then moves your body. It determines what is spoken. It determines everything that occurs. And it also determines the nature of the dream world in which you find yourself, which will become more godly, more beautiful, more coherent and empowered. So you become an instrument of God's action in the world, and that action is that of transformation. Because the power of God is always to bring beauty and joy into the world. And so if you are entrained with that power and completely at one with it, then that joy becomes your state of joy, and it becomes contagious, and everyone around you is filled with that kind of joyousness and of creative imagination that enables us to solve problems that otherwise we wouldn't be able to solve. So the ability to think outside the box, to see beyond the illusion of terror and death and horror, to see the beauty, to see the goodness, to understand the blessings, and to be able to activate those latent potentialities of the situation requires you to be in that state in which you can perceive reality at the subtlest possible level that only God can perceive and activate and bring about those potentials to manifest. Okay, so the slave, that's simply a metaphor for being totally and absolutely in every moment in the receptivity of God's presence, until the non-duality of who you might think you are and God become realized as a single whole. Okay, thank you. You're going.
I think, following on from Rachel a little bit, or at least how I'm perceiving it as well, is that there's a calling out for freedom. There's a wanting to erupt with bringing down the corruption and a system that's so violent and so colonizing. And I'm very grateful to you for helping us to channel that into this new declaration, which, like you say in it, the Declaration of Independence has that archetypal striving for freedom, or I can't remember quite how you put it, but and to put this energy into overcoming all the inner chaos and usurpation of my mind, of my capacities, of everything. I'm not really sure what my question is, But I think it's something about how to, if you could speak a little more about how to channel this rage into something as still as meditation, how to, something that seems so eruptive, so into something very still and silent.
Well, first of all, let's be very clear that the oppressive system is collapsing of its own weight. You don't need to do anything to destroy the system. It is already destroyed. It's bankrupt. It's about to completely fail. And once that system fails, your problem is not going to be an oppressive system of organized violence. It's going to be anarchy. It's going to be all the people on the streets of your own community, of people with guns and people with violent intentions, because they're desperate, they're starving, there is no order any longer, and they have to create their own order, but they don't know how to do it because the very principles of order, of harmony, of unity have been destroyed by that corrupt system, and have left people bereft of resources of spirit, bereft of nobility, bereft of intelligent capacity to make wise decisions and to organize people constructively rather than destructively. We have lost that. We have the system has dumbed us down and broken the spirits of people. So we must reclaim our essential nature again from the false mask that people were forced to wear through the indoctrination of the educational system and the media and all the disinformation that people are getting that are creating, again, chaotic conspiracy theories and false ideas about why this is all happening, and cannot see the true nature of the unfolding apocalyptic revelation, which is what that word means, of the presence of God returning to the world. Once we can see that, then we can know that the world of egos and the evil that is attendant upon ego consciousness is being removed from the world, and very mercifully higher consciousness is coming to replace it. And if we can connect with that, rather than give way to rage, but give way to being instruments of God's peace, then we will bring that peace to the world. But if we ourselves are in a state of violence, then the world will simply mirror that, and we will have defeated ourselves. You don't gain victory through violence. You only gain more hatred and more antagonism and more oppression. So it is only by being embodiments of wisdom, of peace, of love, and of freedom from fear that you will have the ability to organize people around you, whether it's in your neighborhood or it's in a possible community that can be created on the spot out of people who are not organized, and who can bring a vision and a set of principles, a dharma, that can organize the values of the people who must create the new world for themselves without a parental government determining it for you. So there's going to be a power vacuum. It's not going to be that you'll be overpowered so much as that there will be a vacuum of power that will then have to be filled by a higher order of intelligence that can be disseminated and agreed upon by all of those who are suffering because of the disorder. When that becomes clear, then that new order will replace the chaos and the anarchy with a unified field of harmonious consciousness that is all entrained by that supreme intelligence, and then therefore can operate in unity. So we have to let go of the rage and the sorrow and all of those emotional obfuscations of the ego in order to have clarity and to be able to repurpose our lives as servers of higher truth than we have ever respected in our lives, in which we have lived, most of us, atheistically and criminally in terms of our own internal corruption and failure of ourselves and falling into states of depravity that we ourselves are not proud of but feel shame about. So it is that internal failure to live up to our own understanding of who we should be and how we should be that we can now undo and repair. This is the tikkun olam of the Jewish tradition, to repair the world that we have ruined by being in too low a state of consciousness. We can only do by repairing our consciousness and returning to God, that conversion, that return that will then bring a new world, a messianic age, if you will, a new world of godly order. And it can only be done through love and peace, not through rage and not through emotions. And it can only be done through the transcendence of the ego. That's what the commandment is, the mitzvah of loving God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. It is not, there's no room for anything but love and light in a being who is a slave of God, and therefore free of the ego evil. And it's this state of conversion to God consciousness that has to be deliberately determined, decisively, as the one action that we can take that will change everything. I hope that's of help to you. Josie.
Thank you. I think just tonight I realized that I've thought that the term discipline is equal to suppression and just keeping everything down and pretending like everything's great. Maybe that's what it means out there. That's what it meant for me, and it was even praised. And lately, I've been feeling like oscillation between suppression and hysterical events. Because obviously when you suppress something, it's going to come up. Mm-hmm. And I'm realizing now that that's not what discipline is. And then when you said, in response to Rachel's question, you're containing the sorrow and transforming it. And that seems like the middle ground between the two. And activating latent potentiality of the situation. So you're not suppressing what you're feeling or indulging it, but you're using it. And I guess I'm wondering, how could I transform my weighted sense of the word discipline into something that's useful that I can contain and transform?
Okay, that's a great question. Discipline comes from the word disciple. It means you become a disciple of God, of higher intelligence, higher consciousness. And that higher consciousness then, when you are totally devoted to it, which is what it means to be a disciple, it's an act of devotion, of opening your heart and mind to something greater than you are, so that you can become greater than you had been. That's the discipline, and that transforms all of the suppressed energies and makes sense out of them and allows them to be sublimated and used for higher purposes. So anger can become the force that can enable you to overcome the ego if you use it against the ego and not as serving the ego. And the same with all of the lower emotions and attitudes and impulses. They can all be sublimated and used in the service of God. But you first have to be a disciple of God so that you are devoted to that sublimation. And then nothing is suppressed. Everything is raised to its highest potentiality. and the resources that you have that actually are far greater than any that you have used, because the ego uses only a sliver of its full consciousness. Powers that have atrophied or have never been available to you will be activated in your mind and enable you to act much more powerfully and creatively and effectively than you ever could have from the ego. And once you realize that, and you realize there's no end to the amount of creative development of your potential, then you're going to want as much of God consciousness to saturate your mind as possible. And that means letting the ego completely die so you are totally filled with God's presence. Okay. Hanuman.
Thank you, Shunya. I don't have many words to say, but I just want to say I'm ready.
Those are great words. Okay, I'm going to hold you to those words.
Haji.
Thank you, Hanuman. Okay, no more questions. There's one, Tara.
Thank you, Shunya, for the class. I think the main thing that stood out tonight was when you said if we're not in the changeless, then the changes around us will create the chaos. And I feel like we're very blessed within the ashram because the external world doesn't change so much. It's only when you start reading the news or go to town or that you really are affected by them. But I don't want to rely on that because I feel like it can be like a bit of a buffer that I'm in this kind of protective little environment, but I understand that's not enough. So it's kind of it's more of a confession than a question. That I realize I want to make sure that I'm really taking the blessing of being here because I recognize it's an absolute gift. But do I really use it do I use all my time to make sure I'm reaching the changeless? And I realize I don't. So I appreciate the Declaration of Independence you wrote and tonight's class as a reminder and a prompt.
Okay, well, thank you, Tara. And I would say that your honesty and ability to realize what you just expressed is a huge step toward being able to activate your higher consciousness and attain that immovable point at the very center of your consciousness. When you want it, you will be given it. Okay, you just have to really want it. And that means you no longer want to be on the periphery and the surface of your life, but you want to find your center, your power, your source of being, and live from that. And that is the greatness that wants to come out, that is yearning to be fully able to express itself through your mind and your body and your life. And that's who you really are. And so by giving yourself permission to live in that level of empowerment, it will happen very easily. You just have to want it and to know that that is the part you are called to play in this drama of the world that is now coming to its final climactic scene of the Deus ex machina, in which God must emerge from the machinery of the bodies and the matrix to be revealed to everyone as the truth of our nature. And you can be the beautiful avatar of that divine grace and goodness and lead the morphogenetic transformation of the field of human consciousness into the divine through your own giving yourself the right to play that exalted role on this stage. Thank you. Okay, Durga.
Thank you. You talked about, and you have talked before about preparedness, like spiritual preparedness or preparedness itself. What is the equivalent? Because in the external, it doesn't matter how prepared you are, but it's always talked about water as the first thing to have. What is the equivalent in the spiritual preparedness to water?
The water of life, the Shakti, the energy that is that of eternal life. Because when you are assured of your own eternal life, you will not fear the death of the body. And it is becoming free of this bifurcation of the mind between desire and fear that frees you to live in truth and speak truth. And until you've attained that fearlessness by knowing that the oasis and the source of that water of eternal life is yours and it cannot be lost, then you have the freedom to act from the highest level without concern for how others will react to you, and you will have a transformative effect on the world because you'll be able to distribute that same water to those who are dying of thirst.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. Well, okay, well, one more. Josh, go ahead.
Thank you. Mine's, it's not really a question, but rather just would like to express that I would love to be of service in any way that I can to all the beings in the ashram to help prepare physically cleansing the body, with Jake trying to implement more raw foods and just encourage each other, maybe even have more meetings, where we're reading, from the masters and really encouraging each other. Because I really resonate with your talk tonight and really feel like last night in my meditation was getting a lot of energy around this subject and preparing for that ultimate.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think it's important for us not to focus so much on the food anymore, because we'll be lucky perhaps to have any food. And it is more about not having need or hunger or appetite for anything but the water of life of God's presence. And then what we need will be given to us to support the strength of the body. But the focus must be on God consciousness, not on any other levels of cleansing, the purification of the soul, the absolute generosity and goodness of the heart that has no prejudice and no identification with the body at all, and that won't miss the body, doesn't care about the longevity of the body, cares only about bringing goodness and beauty and love and God's presence back to this realm. That is the purification that we need. But we don't even need to do any readings or use any techniques or any change of diet to do that. It's merely about silencing the outer mind and entering the heart and abiding there in absolute peace and silence and presence, and we will feel our oneness with God. And that is something everyone can do now without any other training or any other need for physical purification. We're all ready to achieve liberation at any moment that we determine that that is our highest priority. So I hope everyone chooses that now over any other desires or any other intentionality at a physical level. It's that transcendence of the physical identity that will bring the grace. So I want to begin by expressing my gratitude and my honor to be able to speak with you during this retreat at such a momentous time in the history of our planet. And although we have titled the retreat, if I can read the small print, Spiritual Preparation for Social Collapse, with the subtitle that's been slightly modified, Harnessing and Being Harnessed by the Power of Consciousness to Manifest a New World. It's important that we recognize that to whatever extent we identify as an ego separate from God, we must be harnessed. In fact, one of the words for yoga, the yoke, like the oxen, is yoked to the cart. We are being yoked and harnessed to God's will so that we can serve God in this time of liberation that we are passing through, and that is passing through us and transforming us, all of us. But I would rather not characterize the situation that we are in as one of social collapse, because it only seems that way to the superficial eye. It is a time of liberation from an oppressive system. In fact, from an oppressive, nested set of systems, not simply governmental systems and social systems that have become obsolete or oppressive or that do not allow us to express our whole being, but the family systems and the corporate systems and the internalized systems of the ego consciousness. So we are being freed at this time from all of them, because they cannot sustain themselves any longer, having fallen as far as they have into fragmentation. The center cannot hold, not the center that has been holding in Kali Yuga, and a new center must arise that has the power to hold all together in oneness. And it's that center that we represent. That center of centers. That axis mundi. That power that alone can manage and sustain a world, which we can consider and use such a word to describe that being as God. But I know that not everyone here has a good experience with the term God. And so I want everyone to know that there are many equivalents to that word that we will also sometimes be using, whether it's Brahman or the Buddha nature or the Tao, or it's any of the 99 names of Allah, or it's any of the epithets of God, or the incarnations or mythological representations of God, whether Christ or Krishna or Rama or any of the goddesses or any of the figures of the various creeds of the world that tend to represent God either as a father or a mother or a neutral field of consciousness or that which is beyond all possible description and conception. And all of them are useful and partially accurate, but we need to understand and accept all of those infinite inflections of the Supreme Consciousness if we are to really understand how to proceed on this journey and to make use of the blessings that this time is bringing us, many of which are hidden and disguised as catastrophes. And so we must see with the third eye, and we must learn to listen with the third ear to the words and the inspirations that will come from that infinite source of our being, which is also our own center, if we pay full attention. And so the first point that I would like to make in this retreat, perhaps of, let's say, paradigmatic scope, is my hope that everyone will let go of their paranoid theories of why this is happening. Unless we drop paranoia, which literally means to be out of your mind, out of your right mind, unless you drop the conspiracy theories that everyone seems to be so attached to and convinced by, unless we do that, we will not be able to see and understand the truth that the one who runs this world is God. It's not run by billionaires or political elites or deep states or any of the other theoretical rulers, whether they're Freemasons or Kabbalists or Illuminati or whatever else people are choosing to believe in, and it's not aliens, and it's not any of the other options that people have. And so it will be of most help to you to choose to understand the world from God's perspective, since God is the one making the decisions and determining our destiny. And the more that we are serving that one and not serving any of those others or our ego's addiction to paranoid thinking, then the more benefit we will get from this time period, which will be very short. We are in a very accelerated moment, as I think everyone realizes. And because the speed of time is accelerating, the speed of our own capacity to grok must accelerate. Our capacity to understand more deeply than our ego can do, if we are to ride the wave and not be submerged by it. So I begin with the same paradigm as is valid for from what I know, all of the major spiritual traditions, which is that God is one and that God is all. Whatever seems to be appearing as a world separate from that infinite consciousness is an illusion only to the particles of God consciousness that identify with the bodies they are animating and have become lost in their own finite fantasies and narratives about reality based on a false identification with the animal body. The spiritual journey begins when we recognize that it is a waste of our precious time to live a life based on satisfying the appetites of the animal body, and to try to give it a sense of security from its imagined fears and anxieties and its desires and its foolish attempts to gain power, fame, prestige, whatever else, not realizing that we are within a higher order that determines all of that, based on our goodness and our lovingness, our loving kindness, and our willingness to surrender and be harnessed by that intelligence that alone can guide us accurately through life. So the present moment demonstrates that the ego, if it tries to run the world by itself, separate from a connection to that supreme being, if the particle wants to lead a particular life and does not want to surrender to the supreme whole, the infinite intelligence, it's going to make a mess of things. And collectively, the egos have made a mess of the world to the point that our existence is in the most precarious position it has ever been. And humanity as a species is now threatened with being extinguished from the universe. It's not simply a pandemic that has brought that about. That's just the cover story. The world was already in collapse, and already the drums of wars were sounding and being already fought on many fronts. And the fragmentation of order and the degradation and all of the corruption that everyone knows about, that I hope I will not have to mention again in this retreat. But that's the situation in which we are meeting. All of that has come about because egos have detached from not just the belief in God, because belief is not relevant, but the connection to the source of that intelligence. So what I would like to indicate to everyone, if you don't already have complete awareness of this, is that each soul is a holon. It is a particle that holographically contains the whole. But because it's a particle only, it contains the whole in an incoherent fashion. It's only the absolute whole that can clarify the deep nuances that make all the difference, that enable a reuniting of all of the particles into unity again. And that unity can only come through love of the source of the particles on existence. Because the particles cannot love one another. They are competing with one another. They are all too often envious of one another, jealous, angry, projecting negativity on the other. And so at the level of the ego, there cannot be unity or love or wisdom. And therefore, if we do not jettison the ego mind, which is based on identification with the animal body, we cannot escape the psychology of the ego, which is self-defeating and self-destructive and world-destructive. And so only a return to the infinite, blissful, loving, luminous, almighty intelligence that is the self, the one self, can save us from suffering a fate worse than extinction because of the guilt and shame that will accompany the extinction for our having failed to deliver all the beings who are in our care to safety and to a world of peace. And so it is our obligation and sacred duty to free ourselves from the chains and the prison of the ego in order to receive again the power to be able to manifest a new world. So along with recognizing that God, by which we mean the highest level of consciousness possible, is in control, and we understand that all of this that seems to be a cosmos is consciousness. Everything that appears to you, everything that you perceive, is an appearance in your consciousness. Therefore, your consciousness contains the universe. It contains everyone, everything, as a single whole. But who is the perceiver of that universe? So, each and every one of us is a particle of God, and therefore each and every one of us is a perfect being. And it's as a perfect being that all of us come into this world. But as we come into this world, we take on the veils and the coverings that we are given once we are in the womb of the mother and then born and projected upon and covered in a shell of an ego. Then we become, or at least we think we become imperfect. Because the ego, which is based upon the mind's identification, first, as Lacan said, with its mirror image, and then with the, or even before, with the image we get from the parental gaze, and all of the information we get from how we are treated in infancy and childhood, that creates a self-image that is mostly imposed from outside and is our interpretation. An interpretation that comes from an innocence and a lack of information about the nature of the situation we have entered, and we take on the identity of a lacking human who is now forced to seek happiness and fulfillment because there is a belief that it doesn't exist within. And thus people are always trying to fall in love with someone who will see that perfection momentarily and honor the self that one can no longer see or realize oneself. And so the spiritual journey begins when we reach a point of understanding in which we can deconstruct the ego's self-image and attempt to break through its veils and its coverings and the defenses that we have built around the heart so as not to be hurt again by the other. And we attempt to discover the heart once again and open it. But it is not easy to do so because the effort to do that itself brings to consciousness the repressed pain that we all carry from feeling lacking and imperfect and unworthy of God, unworthy of Buddhahood. But when we do break through, then the perfect being within recognizes that the world itself is only a divine manifestation. It doesn't really exist separate from consciousness. We are in the mind of God at all times because there's nowhere else to be. And therefore the world has always been perfect, but we couldn't recognize that because we were seeing it through lenses of the belief in imperfection and badness and evil. And because the ego, its filters are self-fulfilling prophecies, it creates the evil that it sees, and it magnifies it. And then there's a complete feedback loop of negativity between the individual ego and the world. But once we have broken through the illusion of the ego, then the world itself appears again as a manifestation of God, and every being is a letter in God's ultimate name. Everyone is a manifestation of an inflection of some archetypal attribute that is a name of God that is expressing itself through your life. And maybe more than one archetype, and maybe successively shifting into deeper and more clarified versions of the archetype. So the spiritual journey is to become again the highest possible version of your being and recognize that highest possible self as containing and one with the world and with that which is the source of the world. Can we erase what's on there? During this retreat, I want to give a lot of time to answer questions, both to people here and on live stream. But for this class, I think for the most part, I want to lay out the paradigm so that we can all be on the same page and on the same vibrational frequency. So I hope everyone is open to accepting the truth that you are a particle of God as an ego, and beyond the ego, you are in fact all. You are in fact a manifestation of the Supreme Being, with all the bliss and the understanding and the radiance that comes with that. So for most of us, life takes place on 3 tracks. But for some, those tracks will seem like chronological phases, but they are not. They are simultaneous because they occur in different time zones, we could say. So, for many of us, the world appears as a journey of uncovering, of learning. Growth means we learn more about the nature of the world, we learn more about the nature of the individual self, we learn about the conduct of life, and how to relate to others, and we uncover all of the internal resistances and obstacles and censoring that has been embedded in the ego structure. I use the word uncovering separate from unveiling because I think of uncovering as the uncovering of the subconscious levels of the ego mind, the levels that the Freudians are interested in. Because unless we have been able to free ourselves from certain compartments of forbidden knowledge and unbearable knowledge, we will not be able to see the world as it is or be at peace in our own body. So there has to be that uncovering and release from the pain that has been suppressed and the anger that we may not even know we have, because most of our suffering we are not clear either that we have it or why we have it, and thus we can't let it go. But the second level of the journey is of unveiling the superconscious, that barrier to seeing through this world of illusion, which is an expression of divine intelligence, into the source of the author of this cinema that we are playing our roles in. And so the journey of unveiling brings us the healing drug, the healing medicine of divine love. And without the medicine of divine love, I don't think anyone could ever accept themselves. They could never be released from the guilt and the shame of the imperfect karma that was done under the influence of the belief that one was imperfect. And therefore, there is a second track that has to accompany the journey based on our own world. And that is the fact that in life we are constantly receiving grace. Even when we don't recognize it as such, even when we think it's an insult or a rejection or a denial of something we want, it's always a blessing. We are always receiving grace. And so one of the sensitivities that we must all develop in life is to be able to recognize grace when we are receiving it. And be able to use that grace, which is God's love and forgiveness and mercy and amnesty, to let go of the past and stop being chained to a belief that we have done too many wrong things to deserve freedom and liberation and bliss and salvation from the human condition. And that's the difference between the superego and God, because the superego will never let you off the hook. So it is a false God. And a false villain as well. So the receiving of grace is more on the feminine side. It's more about the heart's peace. And the uncovering is the working of the mind, trying to cognitively understand what's going on, why one has a certain attitude or a certain resistance or a certain addiction or a certain need to create conflict. In India, they speak of the two ways of spiritual development as the monkey's way and the kitten's way. The monkey has to hold on tight to the mother while she leaps through the branches of the tree, and it works very hard holding on. But the kitten just lets go and is carried by the mother and doesn't have to do anything. It's just receiving total grace all the time. So my suggestion is that we do both. But to do both requires that you love God as your father and as your mother. So even though we say God is one, it is important to recognize that God comes to us as two. And I think this is why the word for God in Hebrew is Elohim. It's a plural word, even though it's clear Adonai Echad, God is one, but it's Elohim. So why? Because God has that maternal love and forgiveness and mercy, and also gives the intelligence to make sure we don't make the same mistake again. And we have to develop both. But the higher power is that of God the Mother. It's very interesting. You know, if you look at a Shiva lingam in an Indian temple, the lingam is inside the yoni. The yoni is all-encompassing. The Bhagavan we talk about. And so the ultimate reality is the womb in which even God arises. Even the creator of the universe must arise in the absolute womb of the mother. And then once arising, there is union and then creation. But there has to be that willingness to surrender to such a love that is so total that we disappear into it and no longer exist. And then our being comes back with power. The lingam, the almighty force. But it is clear that the maternal is first. And I think this is the major mistake that was made in the Abrahamic religions, the idea that God creates Adam first. That's ridiculous. He must have created Eve first. And then, of course, Adam can be born as her son. That's the way it works psychologically anyway. We all know that. I mean, that's the way he did it with the Virgin Mary, you know, and got Jesus here through the mother. I'm sure it happened with Adam the same way, and they're not telling us the right story. So there's some censorship involved there for the sake of a patriarchy, which I think has been perhaps the first domino that has caused all the others in history to fall. But in any case, we're speaking mythologically, but we are speaking about what is primary in our own nature. And I agree with the Sufis, the Islamic tradition, that says of all the 99 names of Allah, the highest name and the name that settles on the throne, the ruling name, is mercy and compassion. Ar-Rahman, Rahman. This Rahma, this mercy, is the key to victory over the ego, over Maya. And mercy means unconditional love. And when we understand that our unconditional love is always only love for the self anyway, it's not some altruistic sacrifice. It's in the self-interest of the one self that we are, and therefore the more that we are in that state of mercifulness and receiving the mercy that we need to be able to forgive ourselves and function at the highest level, the quicker we will attain liberation from all of the illusions that are based on our separation from the merciful self. So the third track as I said, is the fact that we are always actually perfect, eternally perfect, beyond time and space, before birth and beyond death, even though our ego mind may not realize it. So the mind, the ego mind, is what the great Sufi Sheikh Ibn Arabi calls the barzakh. Say that the mind, or our intelligence, is both the barzakh and the bab. Barzakh means a barrier. It is something that comes between two things and keeps them separate. So the ego mind's chatter keeps you separate from your realization of God consciousness, which is why meditation requires silence. The silence is the bab. The word bab means the gateway. So the mind is also the gateway. It's the barrier to God consciousness, but if you understand and use the mind in the service of breaking through the ego's delusions, then it becomes the gate that brings you to the paradise of your eternal perfection. So these are the three tracks that are always going. but there is also for Turiya, we'll just call it the beyond. One of the metaphors that is often used, and especially again by Ibn Arabi in his Meccan Revelations, great magnum opus, is to recognize the world as a shadow play. We once showed the Balinese shadow plays that are put on where there's a screen, there are puppets behind the screen, and then there's a light behind the puppet. So you see the shadow on this sheet, and the play goes on with the shadows. We can think of this world as the screen. The puppet is the archetype that you are actually incarnated to live out, and the shadow that distorts the puppet makes it either bigger or smaller or at an angle or however else it's inflected. That would be your bodily being in the world. So your body is your shadow. And it's important not to mistake the shadow for the light, for the sun. And your mind is simply the shadow's inflection in your consciousness that keeps you acting in accord with this distorted puppet. What you want to do is go beyond the plane of the shadow, which is the phenomenal plane, the world of appearance, and go back into that which is unseen, the source of the light of your consciousness, and then you will discover who you are and what the whole play is about. And you will stop being a puppet and become the puppeteer. So this is the journey. But once you have gone beyond, you will realize that this world doesn't exist at all. It's completely unreal, and there'll be no more interest in it. This is the final Ajatavada that Sri Ramana speaks of. But the first three enable one to live life intelligently and successfully overcome the illusions, the obstacles, the unhappiness, the symptoms of suffering in the body and in the karma, and to live a life that is noble, pure, divine, and has the power to transform the morphogenetic field in which the body exists, and to raise the vibrational frequency so that the world can again transform from a hell realm into a heaven. This is what our duty is as servers of God. But the ultimate absolute being is beyond. And that beyondness is important to keep in mind because that keeps us humble. So long as you are relating to a world, whether it's as a learner or a receiver of grace or one who already is in the perfection of that grace, all of those are still illusory. But the higher one gets toward that perfection, the more one is in resonance with the absolute intelligence that is beyond, and the more joy there is. So in the Mijong Tantra of the Dzogchen tradition, it is said that when you break through to the highest level that is just short of the absolute, They call it the realm of laughter, because they say then you get the joke. Until then, you take it seriously and you don't fully get it. I think it's nirahasa is the word that's used. So it is that realm of the supreme blissful laughter of God that we want to be able to hear and to participate in, and not think we're the butt of the joke. Because we're not. We are meant to be heroes, all of us, on this journey to the light, and to bring the light to all who are still in darkness. Another set of names I could give for this one, I would call it the world of the imperative. Life begins as an imperative. God says, be. It's imperative. You have no choice. And you come into this life as a naked being who has to learn everything all over again. But it is imperative that you learn, that you grow, that you discover, that you unveil, that you open yourself to receiving grace and achieve the perfection. So it will seem like a process of development, even though all the tracks are here simultaneously and you are eternally perfect at this very moment, here and now, and don't have to make it a long process of learning the hard way. But the imperative is to be, and to be means to be who you really are, not the bodily, false puppet. The world of creative process. Because as every great artist knows, you receive an inspiration from on high. If it's great art, you are receiving it. Every great novelist or composer has said they received dictation, and the genius came to them. And so our creative process is the second aspect of our life. It's not just the journey of the tests and rites of passage, but the creative connection to the beauty and the love and the brilliance of God consciousness in works of art, science, philosophy, all the cultural achievements. And so we want to have a very active creative process, but a creative process that isn't the ego's attempt to shine or impress, but is a transmission from the beyond into this world of beauty and truth. And then, of course, one has a close enough connection to that one beyond, one enters the world of the Creator and the mind of God. And that, of course, is a quantum leap. But I think we won't go further with that in this morning's introduction to the retreat. I wanted to keep it very simple and light. I hope it is. And I know that everyone here has been on this journey for a long, long time. Many lifetimes. And so there's nothing that you will hear in this ashram from me that you have not already known deeply in your heart. So I recognize that all of you are already the perfect being, the divine manifestation. The question is, do you realize it? Do you give yourself that much credit and that much bliss? If you don't, you have to ask why. Is it because you don't want the responsibility that comes with knowing who you are? Or the letting go of the enjoyments of the lower chakra, acting out and satisfying the animal appetites, even when that is against the achievement of enlightenment and liberation? You have to work out what it is that holds you back from the complete saturation with the bliss of the real nature of who you are, of who we all are, and of what this world is. I'll stop there. I hope this has been a useful overview of where at least I would like to guide people in this retreat to unveiling fully, completely your divine nature and to drop the ego delusion once and for all. So there's still some time, and I would like to open the floor if there are any questions locally or on live stream.
Thank you very much, Shunya. I just want to say welcome to everyone who's joining us online. We have people as close as the Diamante Valley down the road and as far away as Singapore and Malaysia. We're welcoming back people who were with us at the last retreat, past visitors, past Sangha members, and everyone who is new to Sat Yoga. We're happy to have all of you with us and joining us for this retreat. The first question comes from Samuel George. He says, whilst I see the beautiful transformation taking place, it is often difficult to know where to place oneself in a world of fear and conflict. How do we navigate in such a polarized world, now more than ever, in order to not be influenced physically, emotionally, and mentally?
Well, from all I've said already, I think you can gather that the only place to put your attention is into the mind of God. And from there you will receive marching orders and advice and inspiration that will enable you to navigate safely through this world of illusion without being contaminated by the fear and the degradation that may be all around you, and which you may actually be able to transform and uplift and influence in a very positive, beautiful way through charity and through blessings and through role modeling and through the action of recognition of the other as already a divine manifestation. If you're willing and able to do that, the world will not be a problem for you, and it will in fact be a Buddha field. It will be a continuing opportunity to grow and to blossom as a being of love and light and an avatar of God's being in the world. So it's very important to recognize that wherever you are is the accurate place for you to be. And if you are moved to shift geographically, that may also be accurate. There's no way to second guess yourself. But if you're coming from the heart, your actions will be spontaneous and they'll be in alignment with the Tao. And so you don't need to agonize over decisions. it's very important to know that the center of your being and the core intelligence is within you, not without. Don't depend, certainly on media, but don't depend on books, don't depend on teachings, don't depend on Shunyamurti. You don't need Shunyamurti, you don't need this ashram. You have everything within yourself. Claim it, accept it, listen. Become who you really are, not by trying to imitate or even to need to learn from someone else, except to the point where there are blind spots that you cannot undo for yourself. And then if you have the right humility, the teacher will appear, the opportunities will appear that will help you accelerate your process of uncovering and unveiling. But trust that you have all that you need within. And be without worries. And know that whatever is required, if you are in that state of being open and receptive to grace, it will come. And you will be guided. So have no fear. Is there any other questions?
Hi. So you said go beyond the shadow and to the source of the light of your consciousness and stop being the puppet, be the puppeteer, which I totally am aligned with. And then you say, why don't you recognize you're perfect? You don't want the responsibility, you're acting out for lower chakras that holds you back. So, of course, we want to go to the source of that light and stop being the puppet. And also I appreciate what you said about not going to the external to anybody but go within. And the tools to get to that, right? Where you know it, you feel it, your intuition is there, and you're in that state of bliss or consciousness, but then of course the ego pulls you back into the, whether it's the tape or the shadow realm. So why don't you recognize you're perfect? Take the responsibility if you want to, and you're there. Like, what are some tools you can do to keep that ego at bay or continue to be your puppeteer and not to fall back into the world as the human world and stay in the spiritual realm and receiving grace?
That's a very good question, and I'm sure it's universal. So thank you for asking it. As I said before, I think the only effective medicine is divine love. Now, all love is divine love. Whenever you're experiencing love, whether it's for a cat or a dog, or it's for a sunset, or it's for a person, or whatever, the love itself is coming from God. All love comes from God. But if we project that the feeling of love that we have is caused by the person or the animal or the situation, then we will fall into delusion and will follow a false track. But what everyone really wants is to have the most amount of love possible in their life. Right? That's really what everyone wants. Even if they say, no, I want money, it's in order to get love and attention and respect and right, all of those good feelings. So everyone wants love, but the problem is you're not going to get love from the animal beyond a certain point, and then it'll scratch you and it'll leave you and take a dump in front of you and everything else. And so will the human that you may be in love with sooner or later. So if you realize that what you're in love with is love, not the object of desire that has gone with it, then your love will be able to blossom into the total love that is the love that is liberation itself, that is God consciousness. So once you realize that any fall into the ego is cheating yourself of love and therefore of bliss and of wisdom, you wouldn't fall for the trap of taking a few crumbs of goodness when you can have the whole pie, okay? So that's the real issue. Be smart enough to go for the infinite love and bliss, not the finite crumbs that will soon be stale and disgusting. So it is that wisdom that has been passed on by all the teachers of the great traditions. And this is why the spiritual practices of every religion has involved the restraint of your appetite. Why does every religion encourage people to fast, for example? It's in order, it's not simply because, as most people who fast today believe, it will give you ketosis and autophagy and weight loss and all the other, benefits that they might get on a bodily level to be more attractive or whatever. It's not about that. It's about recognizing and allowing God to recognize that, meaning your highest self, to recognize that you want that nourishment. You want the Shakti, you want the bliss, you want the intelligence of God, not the food, not to satisfy the animal body. You want to satisfy the spirit and be fulfilled by the spirit. So the fasting, the brahmacharya, all the restraints on desire that yogis accept, the dharma, is put in place because it protects you from squandering your life energies in karmic relationships that will produce suffering. And once you understand that, then you won't think of the yogic yamas and niyamas as restraints, but as opportunities to flower in the world as divine avatars without the restrictions of attachments that cause one to be partial and limited and unclear, incoherent to yourself. And the more you've experienced real coherence, the more you want more of that. And you'll pay whatever price is necessary to have that. And the more you want love and joy rather than anguish and worry about things, then the more you'll surrender to God consciousness. So I think at a certain point of your development, you realize, well, I'm not wasting my time with that anymore. It's just a waste of precious life that we don't know how much more we're going to get, right? We never know when the life will end, and that's it. So we want here and now to have the bliss of realization, not later. I hope that helps. Anyone else here? Can we give it to Kalyan?
Thank you, Shunya. It's very nourishing to be in your live stream presence again. It's very much felt, and I really appreciated this opening class a lot. One of the first things you mentioned was something that touched me, and you said it can only be the purity and goodness of your souls that bring you to a gathering such as this. And it's very encouraging and relieving to hear that, because I feel so much impurity, especially it seems more and more and more keeps coming. Guilt and these feelings just keep coming up. And I try not to beat myself up over them, but I do. And otherwise I wouldn't feel guilty. I do a lot of the time for having these thoughts. And interestingly, I was looking at the whiteboard in the parentheses, and I guess I had a bit of a slip because I misread what it said, and it kind of speaks to what I was feeling in this impurity. And what I read was harnessing and being harassed by consciousness. And so when you read it, I kind of laughed. And
Freud is laughing.
Yeah.
Wherever he is.
But I often kind of feel harassed by consciousness. I don't know if that's an accurate way to say it.
Or by Dharma.
That, yeah.
Both, yeah.
But it just feels like it's an interesting way to see it. I feel like I'm being harassed by my own self. Yeah. So I just wanted to express that, and I don't know.
No, it's a beautiful insight, and I appreciate it, Kalyan, and I'm sure you speak for many, not just for yourself. In fact, it's a universal characteristic of the ego. Every ego is harassed by a superego voice that says, "How dare you do that?" and "You stupid, idiot," right? I have been an idiot. In fact, I've been a moron, an idiot. All of what was Zizek had 7 levels of stupidity, right? I think it was. We once gave a class on that. I've been through all 7, so I understand where you are with equality and humility. But you reach a point where you don't want to hear that voice anymore, and you don't want to do the things that cause you to feel stupid and dirty, right? So when you decide that you want to stop harassing yourself because it's become intolerable, you can consider that the harassment is the ultimate blessing you've received of grace, because it enables you now to make the decision to transcend the ego. So this is all part of the growth process and the uncovering. You're uncovering all the dirt, which is good, that's important. And now you have to unveil the light and the beauty and the goodness of who you really are, because you're not seeing that yet, because your ego doesn't want you to see it. It's censoring that. You have to see that. Break through the censor's veil of your true divine nature. And the more you're willing to act from that divine nature, with generosity, with love, with goodness, with forgiveness, with lack of judgment and projection, then the more that grace will come in, until your mind is emptied out of all the negative thoughts and self-images and fantasies, and then there will be peace. And then the peace will be filled with wisdom, bliss, creativity, every blessing of God. So you're on the path, and it's a normal and natural phase of the journey. And now you're reaching, I would say, the momentous point where you go from the uncovering to the unveiling. And by turning to God, that's what conversion means, right? That's that idea of you now live for God, not for the human bodily appetites, and then you will receive your divine crown back, and you will be able to be given the throne and to be able to function as a spiritually royal manifestation of noble God consciousness. That's what we're here for. And that's why this whole pandemic started with a corona, with a coronation of our being that came in the form of the ending of life as the ego knew it, and the beginning of a new life. So that has happened externally, and now it's happening internally, and it will happen universally. This is God's process. It's not humans doing anything, but the process of the unveiling, even if you think you have to do it, no, it's a gift of grace. Just as the dirtiness uncovering is a gift of grace, all of it is grace. And the more that you accept it all and forgive yourself, knowing that you were here to learn all of this in order to have compassion for others who still have to learn it, will enable you then to fulfill the mission that God has given you. And it's a very special, unique mission. And the more that you listen, the more you will receive the understanding of the specialness of the being that you represent in your bodily shadow of that divine nature, the archetype, the divine name, the divine capacity and talents and skills that you are given in order to serve God in this world will flower to their ultimate extent. So have trust and faith, and the more that you do that, and the more you allow your mind to be free of the ego thoughts and to be filled with first the silence, but the love of God, the faster the purification will be completed, and you'll be back on the throne of the lotus, and being a teacher and a guide for all those who still have to find their way up the mountain of God. Thank you. So Maria.
Thank you, Shunya. It's great to be here with the Sangha. Feels like home. If I understood correctly, you mentioned in your teaching that the mind in the spiritual path can become an obstacle, and then it also, through the right process, can become a very useful tool for the self-realization. And I don't know what needs to happen when the mind starts grasping concepts or beliefs. What needs to happen to shift that into realization and knowing? What is the process that occurs in the mind, within the mind?
There are two different kinds of thoughts. There are thoughts that come from the ego that will waste your time and degrade you and put you into states of anxiety and lust and attachment and all of those other vices of the ego, the arrogance, the narcissism, etc. And then there are higher thoughts, the archetypal thoughts, the thoughts that come from God when you're in an inspired state, or the thoughts written down by the great sages. So I would recommend that you use your mind to study the teachings of the great sages, of all the traditions, whether it's Sri Ramana or Anandamayi Ma, or the great Christian mystics, or the Kabbalists, or the great Sufi sheikhs, and the Sufi poets, all of the great literature of a higher spiritual nature can uplift your mind to going beyond mere symbolic thought to receive the real, true, blissful vibrational frequencies that can never be articulated in words or even in music. They're beyond. But you can then translate them into words and music and art of all kinds and action that is wise and intelligent. But you have to first receive that, a higher mind. So don't settle for the ego mind. Bring your attention to that level of thought that will come from silently listening to what your real self wants to tell you. And then once you do, your ego will be drowned out and there will be a flow of wisdom that will come from the higher place that will then guide you from then on. So we'll have one more question and then we'll end this session. Okay?
I'll just say that there was quite a response in the comments to the last few questions. And anyway, there's a question from Misty who asks, I've learned the ascetic life doesn't work for me, neither does overindulging. I truly strive for a balance in the sensory spiritual experience. All the pleasures and pains seem to bring a great wisdom through direct experience. What is your perspective on this middle path, allowing for experimentation in order to learn versus completely cutting out certain elements of life? Thank you.
Misty, thank you for your question. Every path is perfect. I make no distinctions between paths. I don't consider the path of yogic dharma as asceticism. To think of that as being, let's say, the sacrifice of enjoyments, because I have learned the hard way that those enjoyments bring an equal and opposite reaction of suffering. That's why Lacan called it jouissance. It's a desire that brings a very unpleasant after effect. So, for me, it's not an ascetic rejection of enjoyments or of experience. It's of a higher kind of experience. But everyone has to go through the kinds of experiences that you do go through. And I agree that for you, the path that you are on is the path that will maximize your learning. So don't try to be ascetic. Don't try to overindulge. I agree. I think that the middle way is very good. Eventually, the middle will change for you. The middle will become what you now think of as an ascetic or higher path will actually be the middle for you. And every path that you're on is actually a middle between two extremes, because the ultimate path is beyond all paths. So as long as you're still on a path, you're in the middle. And when you have finally gone beyond paths because there's no ego left, and you realize all of that was an illusory game that was played in order to have the laughter of the enjoyment of being free of it, then you will end up on what now your ego might look at as an ascetic path and say, no, this is the path of bliss. And there's no rejection of anything whatsoever, especially no rejection of God, no rejection of divine love or bliss, and no need for anything else. Okay, I hope that was useful to people, and I appreciate the liveliness and the earnestness of the questions and of the desire to grow that I can feel is in everyone. And because we are now in the Aquarian age, because we have shifted out of the Piscean and the old rules and limitations on us have fallen away along with the social structures that justified them, we will all be able to feel a kind of spiritual freedom that we may not have felt before, to discover who we are beyond the conventional ways of living that you were taught to want, like a good job and a marriage and a child and a mortgage and life insurance, you know, and a nice cemetery plot or whatever. You know, the whole 9 yards of a stupid life lived in body consciousness. You will end up wanting a little more than that. It may include that, but it will include it in a larger context and paradigm. And all of it, however your path takes you through life, and whatever experiences, traumatic or blissful or both, are given to you, recognize that they are all the blessings of the unveiling of your divine nature, and that all of this is happening whether you want it or not. The revelation is happening, and every day more and more is revealed, and more freedom is given, more grace, more bliss. So don't settle for who you were yesterday or 5 minutes ago, because you're already new and different, and at every nanosecond you are being recreated in the image of God, with all of the majesty and the glory and the bliss that you can contain and transmit. It's all here because that's all that is. There's nothing but the primordial vibrational frequency of the Big Bang of God's expansion into a cosmos, and now the return of that cosmos to its source that is your own heart.